Hi, this is InDesign, Week 8, Webcast 2, and this is Selecting and Stacking Objects. I am going to move right away to the demo file, and I have tons of things I hope are going to help me show you all the different things I want to get through in this webcast. So let's get started. All right, the first thing we're going to talk about is selecting multiple objects. And you have all done this in some way or another so far, but again, I'm just trying to get several of these things into a single webcast. When you're going to select an object on an object level, we are usually using our selection tool to do that. Whether we are selecting an image frame or we are selecting a text frame, we are using that selection tool. And as you know, if we want to change the image inside, or we want to change or alter the outer edge of an image, then we might want to use the direct selection tool. But that's going to keep us just in that one image or that one object that we have selected with that selection tool, the direct selection tool. And as I can see, I've selected this one object here. Let me zoom in just for a moment. And I can change the shape of that object by clicking on a corner. And that's not what we're looking at today. All right, let me let the screen preview catch up. Okay. When we want to select multiple objects with our selection tool, we click on one object, and I can then add to that selection by holding down my Shift key, regardless of the operating system, and I can click on a second object. And I can select the third object. Notice that the selection marquee around that is increasing, and what looks like other objects are selected. But in fact, if we just look at this highlighted edge on this object, this second ellipse, and on this rectangle, we can see that those are the only three objects in that selection. Let me deselect that, and I'm going to zoom in on these little circles. And I'm hoping this will be a little bit clearer. All right. I click on the first circle, and then I'm going to hold down my Shift key and click on the third circle. And you can see that though the selection marquee, let me zoom in a little bit more, so the selection marquee is stretching around everything in between these two objects. In fact, the only two objects selected are this one and this third one. If I hold down my Shift key and click on the fourth object, it's included in the selection. I'm going to skip an object, still keeping my Shift key down, clicking on the second to the last object, and then the last object. When you select objects that are not consecutive, or you leave out an object when you are selecting multiple objects, if they are in a line, for instance, these are all completely horizontally aligned, it's a little difficult at a glance to see what's part of that selection and what's not. But if you're watching those resize handles, those are going to give you the clue as to what's selected and what's not. And I'm going to just drag this down, and it becomes real clear what was part of that selection and what was not. Another way that we select multiple objects is to use the marquee, which I've gone over several times, just touched on that in previous webcasts. And that's where you start a marquee somewhere where something is not selected, and then you drag in. When you touch an object with that marquee, that object is selected. And let me just try that again with an image. I'm going to start my marquee off of the page, drag down, and instead of just touching one object, I'm going to touch that image on the left, the image on the right, and then go down and just touch the very corner of the oval. And now all three of those objects were selected, and if I drag them, they move together as a unit because all of them are selected at the same time. Sometimes it's easier to select multiple objects and then deselect one of the objects that were part of that mass selection. For example, let's say that I want everything from these pink dots going down the page with the exception of this green triangle and this orange rectangle. So I'm going to drag select, touch some part of all of these. Remember, you don't have to enclose an object in a selection rectangle or selection marquee. You just need to touch the object with it. And now everything is selected from the pink dots down. And I can see that because my selection marquee goes from here all the way down and back up on the right-hand side. Now I'm going to hold down my Shift key, and I'm going to deselect the green triangle and the orange rectangle. And I'm doing that just by holding my Shift key down and clicking. And actually, I think it deselected the blue one. Let me grab the orange one here. And then I'm going to drag everything away. And you can see that the two objects that were removed from that mass selection were in fact just the triangle and just the orange rectangle. So the Shift key is going to be our tool to add to selections, and it's also going to be our tool to remove objects from a selection. Another tool that we use to select objects is to use the Edit Select All. And that's a third of the way, almost halfway down that Edit menu. And when you do, it selects everything on the current page or the current spread. If you have a spread, it will select all objects on the spread. And if you have just single pages, it will select all the objects on that page. It will not select things on multiple pages going vertically. This divider is going to divide what it can select. The reason you are seeing the text selection threads is because these text boxes are threaded to the pages previous to this and following this spread. The text boxes themselves are not selected, but the threads are always selected if you select one text box within a threaded series of text boxes. So every object on these two pages, every image, every text box, every shape that I've created is now selected. This Select All command can also be accessed with a keyboard equivalent of Control-A or Command-A, which is a really popular keyboard equivalent for most applications that allow you to select objects. It's pretty universal. Now, some of you who have worked in Microsoft Word know that if you place your text tool inside of a text block and you press Control or Command-A, you get all the text in that flow. And that's going to be similar to InDesign as well, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about text, but just as a little preview, if I take my Type tool and I click in one of these text boxes, and I already said that all of these text boxes are threaded, and I press Control-A, and then I'm going to zoom way back out, you can see that all the text in the flow across this 100 and some pages is now selected. So the text tool, when you press select, or you select all or press Control-A or Command-A, is selecting all text in a story. If that story is one heading, that's all you're going to get from the Select All command. if that text box is threaded across 200 pages, you're going to select all the text in that threaded story, because it all comes down to what is a story. And a story is any series of text in either a threaded series of boxes or just in a plain text box. Now I've got to find the page I was working on, which may be a little back. There we go. All right. I'm going to go back to my selection tool. I'm out of my type tool. I'm going to press Control A again. And as before, it selected all the objects on both the left and the right pages of the spread. When I want to deselect, I have to select off of all selected objects. I'm sure all of you intuitively know that, but sometimes we get confused when we see so many objects covering a page. If I click on any one of these objects, it's going to use that object as the key object for alignment, which we will be talking about in another webcast. To deselect all of these items at one time, I need to select some area of my pasteboard or of my page that does not have a current selection. And I'm going to choose this part of my pasteboard out here, and click, and everything is deselected. Another way to deselect, to get to that command, I'm going to again press Control or Command A to select everything. We do have a command to deselect all, and this is going to work in, especially with your images. It's right underneath the Select All, and you just add the Shift key to the Control A or the Command A keyboard equivalent, and it will deselect everything. I usually will use that command if I am so zoomed into a series of objects that are all on top of each other that I cannot find a place in my view that will allow me to click off of the selected objects. And that comes in very, very handy. And knowing that keyboard equivalent is going to be helpful as well, so you don't have to go all the way back up to the menu to find it. Selecting objects that are on top of other objects, or underneath, I should say, other objects, is a whole nother area of selecting multiple objects. So let's move to that. I obviously have a horrendous design here, but I want to talk about how do we get to objects that are hidden underneath other objects. We know that I can go out and just drag select over multiple objects. And I have all 4 images plus the circle, or actually it's more of an ellipse, isn't it? The ellipse on the left and then the squished ellipse over here on the right. And it would be easy for me to get all of those by clicking on them one at a time and holding down my Shift key, because only portions of those images are covered up. I can still access a part of the image that is standing out away from that other image. But that might not always be the case. And here's 2 examples of this. One, I have a series of triangles that are all, their tips are all overlapping. And then I have a series of rectangles that I'm going to actually align them so that you can't even see the 3 behind. And I'm going to use both of these as examples of how do we access, how do we select those objects that are stacked behind other objects. If I click on the very tip of this first triangle that is obviously on top, I select that particular triangle and its bounding box. If I want to get to an object underneath it, I can use my Control key, or on the Apple interface, the Command key, your Apple key, to basically shuffle through each hidden object in the order that it is stacked. And I think this example, I'm hoping, will let you see this real clearly if you can see the bounding box. I'm holding down my Control key because I'm on a PC, but it would be your Command key if you're on a Mac, and I'm going to click a second time on the tip. Notice now that instead of the green triangle being selected, the orange triangle is selected. And yet I have touched no area, no visible area of that orange triangle. I'm going to control click again, and now the red triangle is selected. And I'm sure you can see that each of these triangles is behind the one on the right. So the green was on the top. The next in the stacking order was the orange, then the red, then the light green, then the blue, and then the purple. And as I am control clicking, it is rotating around, selecting each object that is the next object underneath the previous object. So it's just working its way through the stack until it gets to the bottommost object, which is the purple one. And if I control click one last time, notice that it says, okay, I've reached the bottom, so I'm going to go back up to the top, and I'm going to select the topmost object. Don't forget that on the Mac this is not the control key. There are occasions where we will use the control key for a special keyboard equivalent on the Mac, but for the most part if I'm pressing that control key on the PC, I'm pressing that command key, that Apple key on the Macintosh. So let me just do this one more time. Control click, I move to the orange, the red, the green, the blue, and the purple. And let's say that I want to move that orange. I can take my cursor key and you can see that it's moving away from the rest of those objects. We still have the ability in this triangle example to grab a portion of the image and pull it away from the group without having to access some portion that is underneath another. So I can grab that green triangle and I can yank it out. But I feel like I'm kind of a card dealer here when I do this. I'm going to select these 4 rectangles. I'm going to zoom in on this so you guys can see this a little clearer. And I'm going to use my Align panel to align these vertically and horizontally. And all we'll be able to see then is the orange rectangle, because all of these rectangles are the same size. And so if they are aligned, each one will be hidden underneath the front one. Okay, so let's just remember, we have an orange, we go back, we have a green, a purplish maroon kind of color, and then a bright purple, which may be coming out blue on your monitors, but I'm sure that's a close enough color. Okay, so let's align these vertically and horizontally. And now they're all still selected, so I'm going to deselect them by clicking off of the selection. And now if I click, the only object I can access is this orange rectangle on top. And I move it, but I can't get to the green one. So let's use the same technique we used on the triangle. I'm going to hold down my control key and click. And it looks like what is still selected is this top rectangle. But if I use my Shift key and my arrow key, I can see that in fact what is selected is the green. Now let's do that again. I'm going to hold down my control key again. Right now the green rectangle is selected. Click one more time. And then use my Shift key and my left arrow key, and I can see that what is selected now was the purple. One last time, control click. And again, this looks like the orange rectangle is selected, but using my Shift, let's use my up arrow key this time to really push that up and out of the way. And now the purple is selected. And if this was my entire screen, I don't know if I can get this big enough for us, but yeah, here we go. If this is my entire screen, because I needed to be zoomed in this far to see some piece of detail, I don't have the ability right now to deselect by clicking on my pasteboard area or clicking on some blank area on my page. So this is where the deselect all command comes in very handy. I can go edit, deselect all, and I can trust that even though I can't see the rest of my pages, that I know that this has deselected everything. And sure enough, if I press Control 0, everything has been deselected. All right, let's move to changing that stacking order. Oh, sorry you guys, I'm getting feedback again. I tell you, I'm so frustrated by these. Oh, anyway, that's okay. We've got all of these stars. We had these triangles. Let me just put this guy back a little bit closer to where he was. Okay. To change the order of objects that are stacked, and I'm going to use this one as well so we can have these pieces sticking out. I just want this to be a little clearer here. Oops, too much. Okay, so hopefully there's enough distance between these where you can see this clearly. All right. Let's move this guy over just a bit and this guy over just a little bit. Okay. I'm going to click on the orange, and I want the orange rectangle to go to the very back. We talk about the stacking order because every object that is drawn or placed in InDesign has a different stacking number. And we don't use a number per se, but if you were to just stack up a whole stack of papers and every paper was a different color, that's really what it would be like in InDesign. So if I want to change the stacking order, I need to change this using the Arrange command. And I can access that command by either going to the Object menu and choosing Arrange. Notice that Bring to Front or Bring Forward is grayed out because this orange object is already at the foremost front portion. If I say Send Backward, the green one came to the front. And if I choose that again, say Send Backward, now it's gone behind the purple. Another way I really like to access this command is just right-clicking because it's much faster to access the command. Arrange, Send Backward. Now the orange object is at the very back. So why do I have Send to Back still available? And that's because though the orange rectangle is at the backmost part of this group of objects, it doesn't mean that it's at the foremost back of all the objects on these two pages. So if I click on the orange rectangle, choose Arrange, Send to Back, its visible position has not changed, but in fact it has moved to the back of all these other objects that are on the page. So if you are in a situation where you say to an object, or you dictate using the command, that an object go backward, not go to the back, but go backward, and you don't see a difference, sometimes it's because it is going backward behind other objects that are on the page. The rule of thumb for InDesign is that everything that you draw gets placed on a stacking, I don't want to use the word layer because layers are a different thing, but on a higher stacking plane than any object that already exists. That's the natural order that goes through. Last created object goes on top. But once you start modifying this stacking order, then that stacking order stays modified until you make another modification. So now that I've placed this orange rectangle to the very back, it's not going to change the fact that any new object that I draw is now going to be on the top. That will still be the case, but it means that this orange rectangle that was sent all the way to the back has impacted the order of the stacking order of all the other objects slightly. Okay, let's move to the stacking order of images. They follow the same rules, but they follow things a little differently depending on whether it's a vector image or whether it is a rasterized image. Vector graphics import with transparent backgrounds, which I think is real apparent here. We have this little vet picture, and I click, and you can see that the bounding box goes all the way over the text, and yet I'm able to see the text through the bounding box because a vector image has a transparent background. It's just inherent in what that is. For the really old vector images that were created in the days before we had transparent backgrounds, you may see a white background for the graphic displays in black and white. If you change the display performance to high quality, you can force InDesign to redraw the vector graphic. It's basically reinterpreting the postscript, and you'll usually get that transparent background that you want, as long as it has not been converted to a raster image. The second example here, this piece of chocolate cake. Let me let the background settle. Okay, here we go. And you can see that if I move this over a white background, I chose this because of this big curly Q here. It's real obvious to see that even over an opaque background, I have a frame here that's going behind the text frame and behind the vector image, that I can see through that portion that's overlapping onto that gold background. So it's really nice to have vector images for these purposes, but as you know from looking at vector images are more outliney, cartoony type looking images. It's not going to give you the same impact as a photograph. Sometimes a photograph is what we need. So that brings me to my next example. I have a photo of a plate of truffles. This is just a vector circle just an InDesign circle that I've drawn. And you can see that the image is opaque across its bounding box. Where there's not an image, I have an opaque white background. And it's normal for the photographic images to import with an opaque background. There's a couple of solutions to this. If you have the ability to go into Photoshop, Photoshop can bring these types of images in with a transparent background. So it would be probably a newer file that would have a transparent background. By default, Photoshop years ago used to always have an opaque background layer. And then you would put your image on top of that, and you had to go delete that layer in order to create a transparent background. But that's not the case anymore. You are more likely to get a transparent background going forward. Certain image types of image formats that are not native Photoshop do not support transparency. So depending on whether you have saved a Photoshop image as a TIFF or a JPEG or a GIF, you may get a different result. If an image format does not support transparency, you're going to get a white background. Even if it was transparent in Photoshop, it's not going to be in that image background, which is another reason why people love importing native Photoshop files. Another way to deal with this is in Photoshop to create a clipping path. We do this using alpha channels, and we basically trace the outer edge of this plate that the truffles are sitting on. And then Photoshop understands that anything within that alpha channel or the clipping path that we create will be displayed, but anything outside of it will become transparent. But that takes someone going into Photoshop and creating that clipping path. Now another solution is that if that background is white or a very light color, you have a real good chance of trying to fix this within inside of InDesign. I'm going to select the image. You can see I've got my bounding box here. And I'm going to go up to Object, the Object menu, and choose Clipping Path. And then slide over here to Options. Object, Clipping Path, Options. I'm going to pull my preview over here to the side. I'm going to make sure that my checkbox preview is on. And right now I can see that I have no clipping path. If you have an alpha channel or you have a Photoshop path, then you can use those in InDesign. But if I don't have that, I do have the option of trying to let InDesign detect the edges of that plate. We went over this when we talked about text wrap. And sure enough, it may not be the prettiest thing. I've got a little problem down here at the bottom, but you can see that it has in fact traced that edge, and now that background, that gold background, is coming through. And I may increase, no, that's going to be worse. There we go. This makes it a little bit better. I don't know if you guys can see this, but can you see where it's allowing some of that transparency through here? Because I've increased the threshold, saying you're allowed to accept more pixels that are close to that pixel color, but not exactly the same. If I drag all the way to the left, it's saying you can only accept that one level of pixel, and that's not going to give me any transparency. So I'm going to play with this a little bit, and at 10, I still have this gap down here. I'm going to move this over here to the left, and that's a nice compromise. The entire plate is opaque, but it has done a really nice artificial clipping path around this edge, which is going to be very helpful, because if I wanted to use this clipping path, this artificial clipping path for text wrap, it's going to pay pretty, I think it's going to pay pretty close attention to this and give us the result we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And just out of curiosity, let me change this background color. It's too close to the plate. Let me change that to, oh wow, that's too dark. Sorry. See if I can get a light blue here. How about this? There we go. I think it's a little more obvious now. That clipping path has done a pretty good job. I'm going to, by the way, every time you go into that command, that clipping path, I always find that when I come out of the command, I'm in my direct selection tool rather than my selection tool. So pay attention to that. Make sure you double check it when you go back out to make another modification, because you may get the result you weren't expecting. Let's go to text wrap and just see if we can get a clean text wrap around that wrap. Oh, and we do. So I clicked my third icon. I'm going to increase that just a little bit. And it worked great. We get this really nice wrap. I can increase that, and it's following very closely to the exact shape of that plate. All right. And as I think that makes obvious, once that transparent background is recognized, once you've made it past that point, then you're going to be able to use that for text wrap. And in most cases, that's the reason we want that transparent background, is because we want something to come in and wrap around it. And in most cases, that's going to be text. So I think that does it. Okay. All right. The next webcast will be on grouping objects. So that'll be coming soon. Until next time, signing off.